only to guide and to inspire us, but also to keep the space sacred in what we're talking about, what we're doing, so that everybody will hear exactly what they need to hear for themselves, for their own journey, for the lessons that they need to learn. And it has been my experience when the times where that I did not open sacred space, where weird things would happen. So I'm very conscious to make sure that I do that. And, I could do that silently, could do that, openly, but in this case I did it silently. So, tonight's class is about science and spirituality. I love this topic. I love it. I've been fascinated with it for probably my whole life. I will say that as a fellow human being, isn't everybody interested in what this is all about? Isn't everybody interested in the backstory of things? I mean, I'm trained as a social scientist. I'm a social worker by trade. So I have a master's degree, bachelor's and a master's degree in social work. And my master's degree is in administration, policy, and planning, social planning. So for me to look at systems and understand them and get the backstory is fascinating to me. And then when I combine my shamanic skills on top of that, it's like a home run. I love it. And as a social scientist, I have been trained to look at things with a bit of a skeptical eye. I think we all have to be. Nobody comes into this world without a bias, and there is always backstory to things. So I think it's important to unpack things and to look at things. And also, it gives us a little bit of a clue as to where we've come from, why we do what we do, why are we so influenced, why is our belief system, the roots to our belief system so deep, so deep. Where does that come from? So we're going to talk a little bit about that. The past 400 years, science has been trying to figure all this out. And I'll say it goes back actually 2,000 years ago during the time of Aristotle, who first introduced the concept vaguely of gravity and recognized the four elements. And that was, 2,000 years ago, maybe even a little bit longer than that. But modern science for the past 400 years has been trying to figure all this out. And we've come to some really interesting conclusions as a result of this journey. Science tends to want to measure things, wants to be able to try things on, measure things, figure things out, shake it, hold it, see where it's going. Physics, however, in a contemporary fashion of science, has turned the whole science world on its head. And that's where it really gets interesting and fun. So we're going to talk about this concept of where did we come from in terms of science, what's the background, and then what happened? Because there was a really nasty divorce that happened, that took place between science and religion. And we are all dealing with the after effects of that and trying to make sense of things. So this, just as a general overview, let's just talk about this non-material phenomenon. We live in this world right now currently where not everything can be measured. Not everything can be seen. Not everything is as tangible as those early scientists wanted it to be, so that we could try things on and measure it. This concept of non-material phenomenon is new right now in this world, and it's fascinating because there are so many things that come into our mind's eye, into our daily life, into our thoughts, into our actions and what we're doing. But science itself was based on a very materialistic myth. Everything had to be measured. Everything had to be held in such a way. What's interesting is that science was born largely from Christian theology. During the time of Renaissance Europe, the huge influence on science was religion. And in that capacity, everybody kind of towed the line, because who was in charge at that time? The church was in charge at that time. Now, we don't have a whole lot of written history from other parts of the world, which is what makes this a little bit of a conundrum. What we have and what we know to be true is what was written down in Europe at that time. But what's interesting is that if you look at other civilizations and other cultures, the Chinese have been long at this for many, many millennia about energy and about understanding consciousness. And they didn't have the same rigorous scientific protocols that we had, that Europe had come up with. India had their own sense of Ayurvedic medicine and understanding science and understanding how things worked. And they were always deeply connected to everything. the indigenous cultures who didn't know the modern terms or science that Europe was going through had their own system. And their own system, again, deeply connected to the earth, was also based in the understanding of energy and based on the understanding of matter and how that came about. So one of the things that we're going to talk about is this Christian theology that was so influential. The greatest thinkers of our time and the greatest scientists, Copernicus and Galileo and Descartes, they were all Christian theologists. They all came from that background, that vein. So what had happened was, as we were moseying along in this Renaissance Europe, learning what we learned in the past 400 years, we had this quantum shift as we entered now into the 1900s, and we started getting out of that Renaissance period. We shifted from what was this materialistic view of science to this understanding of quantum physics, and quantum physics turned it on its head. So just as a little bit of an overview, that's what we're going to talk about. But before we get to talking about the details of that, because I don't know how close you paid attention in history in high school and college, not too close, right? And we don't want to do a history of the world, as my husband pointed out, the Mel Brooks movie. We don't want to do that. But we want to get a snippet of where we've come from with that information. So, we are going to talk about our belief system. We're going to talk a little bit about this historical perspective of where things came from. We're going to talk about that Christian theological influence that influenced science at that time. We're going to talk about where that divorce took place between science and religion. And what I hope to do is to try to draw some conclusions to make some peace with the paradoxes and with the polarities that we see today. And then we'll talk a little bit about contemporary advancements. What's out there right now? What do we know to be true about consciousness? This whole consciousness revolution that we've seen take place in the past 25, 30 years has been fascinating. But let's go back to our belief system. How do we know what's real and what's true? How do you know what's real and what's true in your life? Think about it. Thoughts?
I didn't really start to question until the last 5 years, really.
Even not even about spirituality or religion, but how do you know what's true? What you've been
told.
What you've been told, right? Mm-hmm. What you've been taught, right?
Or perhaps what you found out on your own.
Or what you found out on your own as part of your own journey. But for the most part,
How we've been brainwashed.
how we've been brainwashed in some instances, how you've been kind of sold a bill of goods, for some things. But think about that. How did we arrive to how do we know what we know? Well, there's about 4 sources of how we know what we know that are out there. And then I've added 3 more because as a energy worker and a shamanic practitioner, I see that there's some other things that are influencing. And the first thing that is visual confirmation. If you see something, seeing is believing, right? And so you use your 5 senses to be able to know what you know. You have your sight, you have your vision, you have your touch, you have your smell, and you have your taste. Thank you. Thank you. And part of that includes our sensory system, because you can imagine what it's like to eat that coconut cream pie, can't you? And it's just as real without even having tasted it. So your sensory system is right there along with that sort of visual confirmation. But there's another flow of information that's coming into us, and that's our mental perception. That's our 6th sense. That's what exists outside of the 5 senses. So we are getting a whole lot of information, and we are arriving at what's true in our lives as a result of this mental perception. So this sort of interior space that we have is what organizes our life. When you're making your to-do list in the morning, when you realize that you have to do this, A, B, and C to get to D, that mental perception is very, very important to be able to go about your day. You can't get away from that. It's part of who we are. And we organize our life, we figure things out, we hope, we dream, but we definitely use this ability to reason to infer things to be able to get to where we're going. The third part is the knowledge that's based on authority. We have never seen Neptune, have we? I haven't. But we sort of believe it exists, right? Because somebody had a microscope or telescope and confirmed it, and now we take it to be true. There's a whole lot of things that we take on the word of authority, isn't there? A lot of things. And some of those things are definitely scientific based. Some of those things are religious based, but we just sort of accept that it's true. However, there's also a thing called subliminal perception. So, do you remember this big scandal with Walt Disney with the Snow White movie? Anybody familiar with that? So, what happened years ago when Snow White was filmed was your visual perception of a movie is you are seeing 24 frames of pictures in a minute. But because it goes by so fast, the 25th one, which is in there, you don't get to see. Almost as though if you're in a nightclub and the strobe light is going and you see the dark to the light to the dark to the light, it almost looks like, there's a static about it. There really isn't, but it's just how you're seeing things. Subliminal perception is this. When somebody caught on to fast framing the Snow White movie, what they saw in the 25th slide of that was the illustrator's signature stamp, which was a very erotic photo. Now, he never intended for any of us to see that because it was the 25th slide, but that became a subliminal message. So all the roar that happened with Walt Disney Company was how many generations of kids were exposed to this erotic message that was in the movie. But here's the thing. This happens every day in commercials, in ads, in televisions. So what you said, Mary, whether you realize or not that you're being brainwashed is absolutely true because you're getting this subliminal perception that's coming to you. Now, who's not going to sit down their kid and let them watch a Disney movie? You are sort of accepting that that's the authority on that, and you're okay with doing that. However, even with the Disney movie, there was subliminal perception going on there. So that's the third. The fourth is hidden knowledge. The really big questions. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? That big knowledge, those big questions. This is what gets answered to us by our culture, by our family, by our friends, by our religious institutions, by our social norms. Is it true? I don't know. I went to Catholic school for 16 years. So I learned a certain way that things were happening. And I got to tell you that when I was in like 4th grade and I wanted to know why babies went to purgatory, the nuns said, don't worry about it. Stop. Don't ask any questions. Shut down. I mean, and I am not anti-Catholic or anti-any religion, but I remember in 4th grade, like wondering, it seemed like a logical question to me, but maybe not so much, because what we're told and what we're fed and what we believe to be true, or as Mary said, you kind of come to these conclusions as a means of your own journey and figuring things out. So this hidden knowledge, I think, is a part that sometimes it comes from scientific knowledge, sometimes it comes from our family, sometimes it comes from a culture. And if you came from a very strict religious family, you learned it a certain way. And that was the rule, that was the law. But there exists 3 other streams of influence that's influencing our belief system and what we know to be true. So think about just those 4 already. Do you ever, like I do, sit and wonder, is some of this stuff that I've learned and some of the stuff that I've taught true? Is it relevant to where I am? Has it helped me? Has it accentuated my life? Or has it created a limited belief system or a fear in me where I don't want to go and learn anything new? I remember as an inquisitive teenager investigating, taking books out of the library about reincarnation, and coming from a very staunch Catholic family, I was like, that's against the church, you can't do that. I guess if I had listened to that and I would have let that fear stop me, I don't know that I would be doing what I'm doing today, but to override that and say, you know what, I'm going to figure this out on my own. I'm going to see where this takes me. So, but there's another thing called, and I work on this when I work with my clients, called ancestral or generational imprints. And what that means is this, is that not only are you sitting here with your own biology and your own DNA that has come from your ancestors, but you also hold They're energetic patterns. The Bible talks about the sins of the father gets passed down through 7 generations. They're talking about energetic imprints in that, not just your biological DNA. So, things such as mental health issues, addictions, when people say to me, I don't know why I do what I do, but I do it, and I'm compelled to do it, and I can't get out of my own way, oftentimes that's a ding, 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 suggesting to me that what they've got at work within their energy body and their physical body are ancestral imprints. And ancestral imprints are constantly informing us. They're influencing our decisions. And again, sometimes you can't get out of your own way because of what you know to be true. And that might not even be something that you've been taught, but just something that has gotten passed down is very, very deep inside who you are currently today. And let me also say that those ancestral imprints, they can be healthy and great things, and they can be not so great things too. Most of the time we focus on the not so great things. But great artists and great creators and great writers and great whatever, oftentimes those are ancestral imprints. You are getting those gifts, but you're also getting some of the not so nice stuff too out of that. There's also, in addition to your ancestral imprints, there's your own karmic stuff too. So whether you choose to believe in past lives or not, and it doesn't matter, you are a compilation of everything that you've chosen in your life. Every experience, every cause and effect that's happened has brought you to where you are right now at this moment. So not only do you have ancestral stuff that's influencing, but you have your own karmic stuff that's influencing you and that's guiding you. But there's also something that I think is fascinating. There's global imprints. And global imprints say this, that there are 3 universal fears that everybody has. 3 universal fears. And no matter what culture you go to, no matter what part of the world you go to, you're going to find this common denominator in these 3 universal fears that show up in people. And the first one is the fear of abandonment. Everybody has that hardwired, that set within their own collective unconsciousness, that fear of being abandoned, the feeling of being left alone. The second thing is the fear of not being worthy. Everybody, no matter what culture you come from, is struggling with unworthiness. And for some people it's a stronger element, for some people it's not so strong, but underlying a lot of people's fears is unworthiness. And the third thing is trust. We are so not willing to take a leap of faith and to trust. And again, no matter what culture you go to, these are global imprints that we all have, that we struggle with. And recognize them is the first start to understanding why you do what you do. So, there's another thing that comes to us called wisdom downloads. And wisdom downloads is when you get information or knowledge or wisdom or an answer to a prayer or something, and it happens to you in a rather pleasant, surprising way. You go to bed with a problem and you wake up with a solution. You sit and you spend a little bit of quiet time and you create stillness to quiet that crazy monkey mind that we have inside of ourselves, and all of a sudden you get inspired to do something. You are out for a bike ride or a run or a walk, and you get your greatest moments of, this is where I need to go in my life and this is what I need to do. Those are just automatic downloads. And the cleaner and clearer you are about who you are, the more downloads you're going to get. So, and that does not necessarily come from your ancestors. It doesn't necessarily come from your karmic stuff. It doesn't come from your ancestral imprints. It comes because you ask for it. And it comes because you've opened and you've left the space for that. But I got to tell you, if your closet is so filled with stuff that you can hardly open the door, the opportunity for you to get downloaded with inspiration is going to be pretty minimal. You know, I tell my kids, I have 3 daughters, and I tell them all the time, if you buy something new, get rid of something. Because you can't just keep accumulating stuff. Your outside world is a reflection of your inside world. And so getting rid of stuff and clearing stuff out gives you the room, the opportunity, and not only just in a physical realm, but in an emotional world too, and in the psychological world. The more that we can release, the more that we can let go, the more we can make room, the more we have space to download. And if your computer is filled, or your phone is filled, then you've got to delete some stuff and you've got to clear it out. You are not going to be able to put new stuff on that unless you clear that out. So, very important. Now, this is great.
How old is the Earth? Anybody have any idea? 4.6 billion years old. 4.6 billion years old. That's amazing. Now, modern man showed up on the scene about 50,000 years ago. So from 50,000 years ago, prior to that, there was a whole lot of stuff going on that we weren't around for. Animals, sea life, creatures started around 500 million years ago. But 4.6 billion years ago, that's how long the Earth has been here. Now, science has been around roughly for about 2,000 years, but between the Dark Ages and medieval times, we've lost a lot of that, roughly about the past 400 years. Within that 400 years, modern physics has been the past 100 years. Within that time frame, the information age, which is what we're in right now, has been about the past 40 years. Within the information age, the worldwide, the internet was created in 1989. That was 24 years ago. The World Wide Web came out in 1991. That's only 22 years ago. How old do we say the Earth is? 4.6 billion years old. Now, here's the thing. We are living at a time where you can know more information in one day than your grandparents knew in their entire lifetime. That, to me, is fascinating. And that has so accelerated our evolution, our growth, our opportunity to learn. But here's the thing. With opportunity and knowledge comes responsibility. And the reason why we're having this conversation tonight is because lucky us that we live in a country and that we live at a time where you are access and privy and free to know what you can know. You go onto that internet and that web, you can find out anything about anything. You know, when I was in undergraduate in the early 80s, you had to go to the library, and there was a card catalog. I mean, anybody else remember the card catalog? And you had to go to the librarian, and you had to request the magazine, right? And you're writing a paper, and if you're like any college student, you're doing it on the fly, and you're tired, and it's due in 2 days, and you haven't started it yet. And you wait, and the magazine you get has your article ripped out of it, right? That wasn't that long ago. Now my kids can do everything from the comfort of their pajama pants, taking online courses, sitting in front of a computer, not even having to necessarily interact, but just to be able to do everything and access everything. The greatest libraries in the world you can access from your internet. I mean, to me, that alone is mind-boggling. Because in our lifetimes, and we're not that old, we have bared witness to that. We've been watching that. That is quite an evolution. So again, with this comes responsibility. So it comes with looking at these things and saying, you know what? I have to be more responsible about who I am, what I believe in, and what I choose to put my mind and my consciousness to. So let's just talk about science and spirituality. But let's call out spirituality from religion. Because spirituality is that big, overarching umbrella. It includes all kinds of religions. It includes all kinds of spiritual practices. It doesn't have to be religion. You know, in a loose sense, it's our connection to something greater than ourselves. And underneath that spiritual umbrella is different religions. But for religions, it's all about dogma. It's about doctrine. It's about rules. It's about what we have to do in order to maintain society. And if you look back on our earliest religions, or the ones that have been codified and the ones that have been written down, Christianity is a forefront to that. So, making peace with science and spirituality has to take a step back to understanding science and religion. Because back in the day, nobody really talked about spirituality. It was sort of a given. But it was religion. Religion was the deeper roots to that. So, this concept of physics has only been around for 100 years. And there are two types of physics. There is classic physics, and there is modern physics. And the classic physics came out of Newtonian physics. So, the old apple falls and the gravity pulls it to the ground. And then Einstein came along and said, whoa, wait a minute. There's a theory of relativity here, and there's also a concept of curvature and time and space that influences where things are falling and how they're falling. That it's not so clean and clear. It's not so cut and dry. So this oldest classics physics really is coming on the heels of even more ancient science. And the ancient science was what we talked about in the beginning, which was that materialistic view of reality. That if you can't see it and you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. So, once upon a time, religion came from philosophy. Religion, politics, philosophy, science, they have all emanated from the same roots of religion. And the religion that they have come from, again, starting back with Aristotle, who talked about religion, and in the 2nd to 5th century, there was a great conversion of Europe into Christianity. And if you recall at that time, for those of you that are paying attention in history, Constantinople became that Eastern Empire of Byzantine. And during that council, they literally had the permission to edit and change the works that were in the Bible and make it more controlling. And again, this is not a judgment, but back in the day when they didn't want people to have power, what they had to do was they had to tighten the reins. And so the God that was presented in that 2nd to 5th century as a result of these councils in Constantinople was a very, very authoritative God. It was a very punitive God. And it was God that people feared. And it was God that looked a lot like the emperors. It wasn't a God that we, when we sit in meditation, say, let's hang out with and let's get some inspiration. The God at that time was wrathful and could infer its punishment pretty easily on people. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century led to that medieval time. The medieval time from the 5th century to the 15th century, fascinating time. Dark Ages, time of the Crusades, time of the Inquisition. So if you said anything that was against the teachings of the church, what did they do to you? They killed you. So a lot of, which is so interesting, because I work with people in my practice that have past lives when they lived during the Inquisition that have superimposed themselves on their current life. So people who are feeling like they're being called into the healing arts of whatever sort, whether that's massage or Reiki or hands-on healing or whatever that might be, have that old cellular memory of that fear of speaking that truth and living that life, because once upon a time they were tortured and killed for being heretics. And I see this with a lot of contemporary healers right now. And again, remember those 3 universal fears that we have? That's at play too. So but I see this, and I'll tell you a story in a little bit about a particular client where this really showed up. So between the 7th and 8th century, who was writing down the history? The monks. Because they were the ones that were educated. They were the ones that, not necessarily holding the power, but they were the ones that had access to the written word. So they were the ones that were given permission to interpret Bibles, to rewrite them again. There was no printing press at that time. Everything was written by hand. So around the 14th century, the Black Plague hit, wiped out a good part of Europe. But what happened as a result of that? The Renaissance came, and all the Renaissance thinkers, and there was a rebirth. And with that Renaissance became the start of science. But again, remember, the power holders were those that were connected to Christian theology. So those people that created the beginnings and the basis of science, Copernicus, Descartes, Galileo, Newton, they were all Christian believers and theologians. So all of their works were infused with that. So I think it's also interesting for those of you, again, I was raised Catholic. St. Thomas Aquinas was the one saint that meshed together the works of Aristotle with the contemporary of his times, works with Christian theology. And he had a lot to say about science. So if you really want to go back and look at the roots to science, they had really deep religious roots. And because, again, there was an effort to control people, and the church made God a very wrathful God, what they made very clear to people was that because of original sin, and because of the fall of Adam, that nobody had the right to have that God force energy about them. That God was separate from us, that it was something that you couldn't ever attain. Now, it sounds to me almost like such a radical idea, because as a Native American, when we look at what the Christian mythology is about the Garden of Eden, and about how, from our perspective, the Judeo-Christian tradition was kicked out of the garden as a result of original sin. Now, the Muslims were never invited into the garden, right? You know, it was really just the Judeo-Christian, nor were the Buddhists, nor were the Hindus. But the indigenous people, the Native Americans, those people close to the earth, we never saw ourselves as being kicked out of the garden. We see ourselves as the caretaker of the garden. So the Christian mythology that exists for a whole lot of people in this world about original sin, and there's that not worthy part, remember what we talked about, one of those three primary fears that we all have? That original myth of the fall from grace didn't really affect a lot of the indigenous people. So that idea of separateness, that idea of abandonment, that idea of worthiness, it wasn't really on our thing. We were taking care of the flowers. And as for the other ones, they were never invited to the garden. So again, there's very deep roots. Questions so far? Got everybody? Okay, good. So, European Renaissance happens, scientific revolution happens, and now the scientists are pretty guarded about what they want to say. Crap, if you saw that people were, in the Inquisition, murdered, tortured, and killed, you'd be a little leery yourself about speaking up, which is why, hi, can I help you?
Is this for the movie yet?
It's not till 7 o'clock.
Okay, and then do we just come?
Yep.
go out?
Yep. So if you're a scientist during that time, and you're starting to do experiments, just take, Copernicus, and Galileo. They're realizing that, guess what? The Earth is not the center of the universe. It's really the sun. But the church is saying, it's not. And which is interesting because Copernicus never published his works until after he died. He was no fool. He didn't want to have the wrath of the Inquisition on his tail. Galileo, on the other hand, had to face the Inquisition and was forced to recant. And then 200 years later, the church said, we're sorry, we didn't get it right. But even those great thinkers and scientists had to tread very lightly on this because they knew that they were going against the tide with what the religious institutions were saying. This created a whole lot of political tension because what they started to believe to be true wasn't in line. And as a result of that, the church had to rescind their opinion on science. They had to backpedal a little bit because as these experiments started to come true, and as they started to see that what the scientists were finding was indeed not in alignment with this wrathful God and the God of control, they had to kind of backpedal a little bit. And as a result of that, the pendulum swung the other way. So people who believed so blindly with the church started to reject the church and started to move in the direction of the science and the sciences. Now, as we evolved and we get into that 16th, 17th century, 18th century, and these scientists come up and we start to discover things, the gap gets even wider. And this is where the divorce happens between science and religion. Because people said, enough. I only want to believe what I can see. And in essence, when we throw the baby out with the bathwater, everything goes. And during that time period, everything went. People became very polarized. And even though the church was treading lightly, they knew that they were up against this materialistic science that was measuring and weighing things and saying that things are not what they appear to be. So
people at that point revolted. And as we moved into this materialistic reality or point of view within science, we pretty much, by the end of the 19th century, thought we had it figured out. Newton came along, there were other great scientists at that time that came along, and they said, we got it. I think one of the quotes that I read was, we don't really have to go any further about learning what we need to. We know everything that we need to know. We have it figured out, and we have, in essence, separated ourselves from the church. And remember, hold that thought, we'll get back to that. However, this little thing called the atom comes along. And when the atom comes along, we learn about quantum reasoning and quantum mechanics and quantum physics. And so this nice little orderly universe that Newtonian physics had in place got turned on its head. Because now we realize that with the atom, and I am no science expert, but there are waves and there are particles. Is anybody good in science? Anybody have a good, Linda, you got a handle on science? Okay, so mine might be as good as it gets. So there are waves and there are particles, and waves act as motion. Think about waves in the ocean, waves. And particles act as individual objects. So if you are going to hit billiards on a pool table, that is more of a particle, and the wave would be the motion, the bigger picture. And so within the atom, as we start experimenting with this, we assume that a wave is a wave and a particle is a particle. But what they find out, the scientists, to their amazement, is that sometimes a wave can be a particle and sometimes a particle can be a wave. And the ability to predict outcomes got turned on its heel. So we couldn't weigh and measure the things that we wanted to. And classical physics held them as opposites. Now modern physics, quantum physics, held them as complementary. They had to work together. They were no longer opposites. And this is the basis of why science got turned on its head. Because we realized that this nice, neat little orderly world that we thought we had all figured out by the turn of the century in the 1900s turned out to be not as neat and orderly as we would have liked it to be. And as a result of that, Einstein comes along, Niels Bohr comes along, Heisenberg comes along, and part of what they start to experiment with, and this is fascinating, is that just by observing something, you can shift the direction in which it's moving. So these atoms and these waves and these particles can be influenced by our thoughts. Now, that furthermore creates a monkey wrench in science, because that is a conversation that nobody ever thought would happen. And the rest is history. Once we did that, we knew about lasers, we knew about microchips, we knew about atomic energy, we knew about atomic bombs, atomic clocks, and it literally, figuratively exploded into this whole new renaissance of science. And so, what has happened to all that classic, we know everything, roots of science that we had in its origins? Well,
We know nothing.
we know nothing. Well, here's the thing. We tend to, in this middle world here, polarize things. We tend to say, I'm on the side of science, or I'm on the side of spirituality. And the truth of the matter is that the bridge to these things, to both of these things, that connects both of these things, is our mind, is our consciousness. Now, our mind and our consciousness was never examined by the old classic science. Why? Because you couldn't measure it, because nobody could wrap their heads around your mind. And then towards the end of that classic time of scientific leaders, they said, okay, your mind's in your brain, so let's look at your brain. So they looked at the gray stuff, but they couldn't find your mind. They couldn't find your consciousness. Couldn't find what we call our soul, what animates us. So therefore, they took it off the table. They just didn't even want to talk about it. But we're the observer doing the experiments, aren't we? And you can't take the observer away from the act of observing. In essence, it's like the scientists are taking themselves out of the equation who have discovered all these things. So the bridge between science and spirituality is our mind, and our mind is our consciousness. And our consciousness is not local. It's not limited to space and to time. And so this explosion, once again, of now consciousness, on top of all of the atomic and the nuclear stuff that we know, is the next wave of science. But it can't be denied any longer, because there are so many offshoots to this. When we look at what we know right now about energy medicine, and we look at what the Chinese have always known about meridians and acupuncture and their chakra system. What's that?
And metaphysics.
And metaphysics that have been around for eons of time. But nobody ever wanted to talk about that because it didn't fit into any equation. Nor would they want to acknowledge that you were powerful, because remember, if your roots are in the religious theology, Christian theology, you were not equal to God. You did not have that God force energy in with you. So who are you to say that you understand things, or that you could heal, or that you could do whatever? Fill in the blank. Distant prayer. I mean, we don't even think twice about it any longer, do we? If somebody needs help, you pray for them, or you're part of a prayer chain in the group. The Wailing Wall, there's gazillions of prayers put into that wall because we understand the power of distant prayer. Distant healing. I do remote healings for people all over the country. I don't even have to have them with me in order to work and do the healing with them. Animal-human relationships. Who would have thought? I mean, what we know now about our connection with animals, our ability to communicate, our ability to sense, their ability to sense. How about transplants? You get somebody else's heart and all of a sudden you have this inkling to want to smoke or drink? Who'd ever thought? And those organs that are transplanted hold that person's cell memory, holds their belief systems. Everything is imprinted into every one of our cells. So you take somebody's heart out of their body and you put that heart into somebody else's body. And the studies are endless about recipients having dreams, about if that person was killed, about the person who murdered them, or if that person, there's a famous story about a little boy that was connected to the Ninja Turtles, back in the 80s when they came out. And the person who got his heart or organ or whatever became obsessed with these creatures and had no idea why, and it wasn't even age appropriate. I think it was like an adult that got, and only until they talked to the donor's family, which nobody wanted that to happen either, but that has evolved too, did they find out that this little boy who was killed in this car accident was just obsessed over the moon about this. Past life work, past life regression work, it's been around for eons. But now we've made that space for that to understand. And, say what you will about it, but there's a whole lot of documentation about people that can literally draw maps under regression, under hypnosis of places in parts of the world where they've never been before, where they can tell you, make a right, make a left to get to wherever they're going. Or they can speak a language that's called xenoglossy, that they've never been trained in, that they've never been exposed in. There's a famous story of a little boy who started talking about his life as a World War II pilot. And at first the parents thought he was crazy, only to find out when the boy started giving names and the name of the airplane and details, and they started looking these things up, that person existed, and able to tell the parents who was part of the crew, and it was true. It's hard to deny when a 7-year-old kid comes out with this stuff, because where are they getting that from? It's hard to deny when somebody speaks another language, only to find out that it's a lost romance language that doesn't even exist, not even used any longer. We would have never fathomed this 100 years ago, even though it was there, but people wouldn't speak of it. People wouldn't talk of it. There was that old fear, again, that lingered about you are a heretic, you are somebody that practice sorcery, you know things, you shouldn't know things. And countless times when I work with people, they say, I don't know how I know what I know. I don't feel like I should know it. I feel like it's a sin to know it, because that's part of that belief system that we came part of. Remote viewing. This is another fascinating topic. Anybody hear of remote viewing? There was a man in the Army named David Morehouse, and David Morehouse was hit in his helmet during wartime. I want to say Vietnam War or Korean War, something, not one of the world wars. And the bullet hit him in the helmet, did not penetrate his skull, but the reverberation of that bullet created in him the ability to be able to see things that were going on in different parts of the world. It's called remote viewing. So he was taken by the Army and trained. Now, of course, in its purest sense, we really shouldn't be using these gifts to spy on other nations, should we? But that's in essence what they trained him to do, to spy and to see what was going on behind enemy lines, because he had this gift of being able to do some remote viewing. He is still teaching. He's now out of the Army, but he still teaches the techniques and has maintained that gift that he has of being able to see. And I will tell you that from a shamanic perspective, it makes great sense, because there are many times where I can remote view myself to another place to see what's going on. We all have that gift. We just don't practice it. We've just lost it. We just don't know how to cultivate that. Synchronicity. The old science said everything was cause and effect. The new consciousness, this new revolution in science, says it's synchronicity. Things happen, what we talked about before. You get to one thing and somebody takes you to another thing and you meet the next person. All of a sudden you realize, how did this happen? I'm in a new job, But the synchronicity and the falling into that rhythm and into that flow of where you should be and being in line is a wonderful gift. Psychic ability, telepathy. The topics are endless for how many things have offshooted as a result of courageous scientists that have taken those leaps to say, this is not all there is. And the focus today with neuroscience and neuroimmunology and neuropsychiatric work and neuropsychological work is bridging the gaps, understanding our mind and understanding that part of consciousness that for so long science just ignored and negated. One of the things that is fascinating, two pieces that's out there right now, is the study of the different parts of our brain and our brain chemistry, and of course the Chinese and the Asians always knew this about meditation and the benefits and how it shifts your brain waves and how it allows you to go to a place of non-locality. For anybody that's ever done a healing session with me, I can take you out of linear time, ordinary time. And so when people are on the table, they don't know how long that they've been in that state. They don't know, they lose track of that ordinary time that's on the clock because we step outside of that time. And this concept of non-locality and stepping outside of time has been done for millennia. But we're just now beginning to accept it. We're now beginning to integrate these things. The only thing that, in terms of connecting and putting all this together, there are Christians in this world, 2.2 billion Christians right now on the planet. There are 1.6 Muslims, 1.6 billion Muslims, people who are actively practicing their faith. There are 1 billion Hindus, and there are 488 million Buddhists. If you add that number up, that's over 5 billion people on the planet that are practicing some form of religion. And if you accept that what was codified, the beginnings of most religions, started in Christian theology, and then they offshooted when the church split and it became the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church, and then other places of the world sprung up. But in terms of what's been written down, it has its roots in Christian theology. It has its roots in not being good enough, being separate from God, being unworthy of stepping into your own light, and also not trusting that you're going to be taken care of, that it's a wrathful God, that it's a vengeful God, that it's a capricious God. So belief systems that are out there for 5 billion people on the planet, whether we realize it or not, are influenced by these early roots of what came about in science. Now, how do we make peace with that? We make peace with that by understanding that you don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And one of the great examples of that is, and I use this a lot, is Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, by many accounts, was a great man.
Slavery and his speeches and what he stood for in this country did wonderful things. He was also himself a proponent of slavery in his private life. So we can look at Abraham Lincoln and say, was he a great man? Or was he a not so great man? You see, within each of us exists that polarity of greatness and of not such greatness. And if you choose to polarize yourself and say, he was great, then you are negating the fact that part of him, and we call this in energy work, the light side and the shadow side of us. We're negating the shadow side of Abraham Lincoln. The truth of the matter, he was both things. And to be able to hold both things at the same time is the path to healing. Because that means you can hold a paradox. That means you don't have to polarize yourself to say it's either A or it's B. So to be able to sit in a place of understanding that within each of us exists great opportunities for creation and great opportunities for destruction under certain circumstances gives us that pathway to being able to see things from both sides and not have to be so polarized. Because what happens when we polarize? If I'm right, that makes you wrong. And then we go to war on this planet over whose God is the right God. Our biases, our belief systems are so thick that we can't see past that. So being able to hold all of these things and see that there is light sides and there are shadow sides, just as there's light sides and shadow sides to me and to you, everybody sitting here, allows us to become whole again. If not, we're fragments. We're polarized. We're only seeing the light. Or most people only see the dark, don't they? They don't see the light at all. And that exists out there. But I'm going to remind you that it's only been the past 30 years of this information age that we have the opportunity to excavate our own truth. We have knowledge, we have opportunity, we have the right conditions to be able to excavate our own truth. And I gotta tell you, your truth is going to be different than my truth, and it's going to be different for each of us. But what you need to look at is your belief system that holds you back from excavating your truth. And so at the end of the day, as we start talking about science and spirituality, what we have to look at is what's underneath that? What's the thread? What's the energy? The energy that runs underneath that is our belief systems. And so knowing where you came from allows you to make better choices. Allows you to say, I can see that there's a lot of shadow aspects to this. It's like our country. Great country, isn't it? Wonderful country. But built on the backs of slaves. We came here to escape religious and political persecution, only to steal the Native Americans' land and to bring slaves over to build our homes. Is this a great country or a horrible country? It's both. It's both. We have to see the polarity in both of these things. What's interesting is that the bridge between classical physics and modern physics is that duality principle of that wave particle. There's the bridge there. So if the bridge between science and spirituality or religion is the mind, the bridge between classic and modern physics is that duality. It can be both. And they use the word, and I love the word, that it's complementary. And at the end of the day, that's what we're talking about. All these things are complementary. Everything exists on a scale of polarities. But you have to have the dark to have the light. You have to have the yin to have the yang. It's complementary. So instead of fragmenting and being so quick to judge and take sides, look at the bigger picture, the wholeness of things. just want to tell you this, two really quick stories to illustrate how this lives in our life right now, currently today. I have the wonderful privilege of bearing witness to people's stories and to be able to help them understand and make some sense of their lives and what their soul contracts are that they agreed to in this lifetime. That's the gift of the shaman, to be able to see this. And up in New Jersey, I have this client, and I've been working with her for a couple of months. She's a lovely woman. I'm just going to say her name is Sue, because I don't think there's any Sues here. So this woman, Sue, wants to step into spiritual work, wants to get out of what she's doing and feels a calling into spiritual work. And she's a beautiful person. And she channels angels and saints. They come to her and they speak to her, and she writes stuff down. And she's been working with people individually, but not in a professional way, with giving them messages and helping them, because different saints come to her, different angels come to her to give her. So she calls it angel readings, what she does. And she's remarkable. She does great work, but she's afraid. She doesn't really want to step into this work. She doesn't want to leave the day job with the, with the IRA and the health benefits to be able to do this work. So anyway, she comes in to see me a couple of months ago, and she starts telling me that she's having these connections with Mary Magdalene. So for those of you who are not familiar with Mary Magdalene, she was a friend of Mary, the mother of Jesus, and she was demonized by the church. In the Bible, they made her out to be a prostitute and just a not a very clean person. And so my client Sue is starting to channel information from Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene is making very clear who she is and giving her information. And she's not sure where all this is fitting into her life. So as she's telling me this, one of the things that I do is I get these pictures in my head that Spirit starts to download about what's going on with this person. And as she's telling me this, I literally, the hair on my arm started to go up, and the hair on the back of my neck started to go up. Because what they were showing me was this picture and this image of her, and why she was stuck where she was right now in contemporary time. And so I shared this with her, and I said, I have to show you what I'm being shown right now. And she was a very faithful person, a prayerful person, and I said, you were at the foot of the cross when Jesus was crucified. You were a friend of Mary Magdalene. And I can tell you that I can see that you had a shawl over your head, and you were a healer, but you were afraid to be seen, so you were literally crouched down, and you were away from Mary and Mary Magdalene. And there was another woman named Agnes that was there. And as I'm even saying this, I'm like, is this real? But I've learned to trust, and I trust it. And I said to her, you were there, and you were Mary Magdalene's friend. And when Jesus was crucified and his belongings were scattered, and the soldiers took him down off the cross, they gave his body to his mother. And his mother and Mary Magdalene and Agnes, movie's not till 7.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. We're just having a class.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
fine, oh, good.
Yeah. His body was given to those 3 women who washed his body and prepared his body for burial. And I said to my friend Sue, there's nothing in the literature that says this, but you were there and you helped them, but you didn't show yourself until all the guards and everybody left. Because, for God's sake, if you've just seen somebody become crucified, the last thing you want to do is to allow yourself to be exposed as somebody that does this heretic healing work. But you were loyal to your friend. And the story goes that Mary Magdalene was maybe Jesus' wife. The Bible doesn't say that, but there's a lot of stuff.
Do that using your skill set. If your skill set, shit to him.
I didn't see somebody come in. Mary, can you just go in and see
Your problem. What are you doing here, man?
ask him if we can stop the movie? Hi. That's okay.
You're right, but
Thank you. We're almost done.
It's always when the story's getting good, right?
Yeah.
So I said to her, you, after everybody left, you revealed yourself, and you were her friend, and you helped to prepare that body. But you were so immobilized with fear of being caught and being exposed that your cell memory in this lifetime has kicked in, and you have a wonderful gift. And the reason why Mary Magdalene's coming to you is because she's paying it back for what you did for her in that lifetime of helping her, of being a support. Silent, even though she was a silent support, which was understandable. But she died in that lifetime, a very broken person, having witnessed what happened to Jesus and what happened to Jesus' followers and the family. And she comes back in this lifetime now with this amazing gift and this ability to channel angels. But she's scared to death of being caught and being found out, so that she can't even do her work out in public. But who shows up for her in this dream state but Mary Magdalene, to say, look, you have got to do the work that you're born to do. You have got to step outside of your fear. And what are the three fears that she's afraid of? The fear of abandonment, the not being worthy enough to do this work. Who am I to do this work? I'm not deserving of it. And the not being able to trust. It's the same three fears that we have talked about, that's ingrained in this belief system that has its roots in the basis of science and religion and where we've come from. So, take a look at where those three universal fears live within you and understand where they're coming from. Because it's not just what life has done to you along the way. Because everybody has their story. But it's the theme, abandonment, unworthiness, and trust, that we are all struggling with. It's our common legacy. And the reason why we have that common legacy is because of the roots of where we've come from. The good news is this explosion of consciousness and this explosion right now of opportunities to learn and to understand about our consciousness, to understand what we're capable of. You know, I say to people all the time, if you realized how powerful you were, you'd be afraid to leave the house in the morning. Because every thought, every action, every word that you have holds power. And you have the power to create, and you have the power to destruct. And I gotta tell you, most people are not afraid of the destructive part. They're afraid of their light, of their ability to create. Because why? They feel abandoned. They don't trust. They don't feel worthy of it. This is where it's coming from. This is the limited belief system that we have that's been passed down through your ancestral imprints, through your knowledge that you've accepting of authority, through your religious institutions, through the cultural norms, through your basic education. This is what's been passed down to you. So just know where it's coming from, because I got to tell you, when you know where it's coming from, you can make a different choice. You can make different choices for your life. You can change the whole trajectory of your life. There is work out there right now, besides studying of the brain, that talks about time openings, how you can go through different time openings to be able to create the future that you want. That's the next wave of physics. And if you're interested, I'll give you the book that talks about that. It's a little complicated, but it's fascinating. It's fascinating. You can time travel. And this is a proven physics concept. We've come a long way in 100 years, haven't we? It's amazing. So apply this to your life. Look at your life and see where you get stuck. See where those fears show up. And know that it's not personal. It's not you. We're all dealing with them. And just knowing that makes it easier sometimes to kind of trudge through. Thoughts, questions? Thoughts. Does it make sense?
It does.
Absolutely.
It's scary. You know, it makes sense, but even though the science is there, there's still so many people that don't want to believe.
That's right. Because they're still stuck in the old,
Yeah, because there's
the
still
old scientific
so-
method, right?
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, and you just wonder how long
Right.
it's going to take for there to be the really big.
But
surge.
notice the imprint that when you talk to those people and you bring up the mind and consciousness and these things, they don't even want to talk about it.
No, right.
It doesn't exist.
Mhm.
That's fascinating to me, because
Yeah.
that's what we did 400 years ago.
Yes.
We took it off the
Mhm.
table.
Yeah.
How do you deny that in today? In today's world, with
Yeah.
all that we know. Why? Because we're willing to experience it, because we're not as afraid as we used to be before about stepping outside.
We are still afraid.
And yet we're still afraid. Yeah, that's right.
I mean, this was awesome and get moving forward for me and you know me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Still afraid.
Yeah. Well, what you have going on in front of you, whatever your challenge is in front of you right here, is part of this bigger picture.
Right.
And that's what you're saying. And that's exactly it. Because everybody comes into this
So I'm saying this
lifetime
was awesome.
with a challenge, right?
Yeah.
But knowing that you can put it in a bigger frame right now,
Right.
knowing that it's not just your stuff, that this is an imprint that we're all dealing with, that we're rowing the boat in a different direction right now,
Right.
changes us from being so myopic and so micro into seeing the macro, into seeing the bigger picture.
For sure.
Yeah, yeah. Because sometimes we kind of get lost in our own pity party about what's going on in our life or what we're seeing in the world. No, there's something bigger going on.
Yeah.
So physics, even though it's a scary word, is a fascinating, fascinating world. And if you are so inclined to keep studying, Google physics, Google quantum physics, Google time travel. You will find, again, only in the past 21 years have we had the ability to know and to learn and to explore what none of our ancestors could do. But with that comes responsibility. Now what are you going to do with it? Now change your life. Right. Right. And influence the lives around you. So, I know it's movie time. So if you have any questions, you can email me, drop me a line. A lot to think about and a lot of information, but again, for me, the message is the limited belief systems that are underneath all that and where they've come from, making those connections. I wish you all well. So you were here for a reason tonight.